All right. Well, welcome back, everybody, for our second panel. Again, I will go over some housekeeping. My name is Mindy Buchanan. I'm the Director of Patient Programs at the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, and we are pleased to host this event with our friends in partnership with Sarcoidosis, Stronger Than Sarcoidosis. So each panel will be 50 minutes with a 10-minute break in between. And as you guys just witnessed, the super fun time it is to witness the sound check. So you guys can feel free to step away from your computers and mute your devices if that's easier. If you need to drop off and want to join back later in the evening, you may use the same link. It will be good all night. The entire event is being recorded and the recording links will be made available to you by the end of the week. And while the panels are not meant to be question and answer sessions, you may pose a question via the Q&A function. If there's time, we will get to questions if we're able. As you can see, the chat function has been disabled and we are not able to respond to raised hands. So you'll probably see, if you raise them, you'll probably see me dropping them down. So please do add your question to the Q&A section. So now that that's out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our second panel. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Obi. She is a practicing physician and researcher in sarcoidosis. Dr. Obi also serves a high population of African-American patients and also has a high percentage of rural and financially challenged patients. Additionally, Dr. Obi is a member of FSR's Women of Color Clinical Advisory Committee and the FSR Scientific Advisory Board. Welcome, Dr. Obi. Next is Dr. Nader Sweiss. She's a specialist in rheumatology and sees a wider variety of patients with autoimmune diseases. Dr. Sweiss directs the Bernie Mac Sarcoidosis Translational Advanced Research STAR Center, which she helped establish together with Bernie Mac Foundation at the University of Illinois Hospital and Health Sciences System in 2021. Welcome, Dr. Sweiss. And next I have Anne-Marie Montijo. She serves as the Deputy Director for Strategic Initiatives with the Association for Mental Health and Wellness. As a licensed clinical social worker with over 29 years of experience, she has extensive expertise in mental health, both as a practitioner and administrator. Anne-Marie's leadership roles include mental health education to the community, support groups, a helpline, and anti-stigma work. Welcome, Anne-Marie. And finally, and last but not least, our moderator for this session is Craig Lipset. Craig is an advisor, educator, advocate, and innovator focused on novel solutions for clinical trials and medicine development. He's a vice president of FSR's board of directors, as well as a person with sarcoidosis himself. Craig is a co-chair for the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, vice chair of the MedStar Health Research Institute, and serves on the editorial board for Therapeutic Innovation and Regulatory Science. He is an adjunct assistant professor at Health Informatics at Rutgers University and adjunct instructor in the Center for Health and Technology at the University of Rochester. Finally, Craig is a founder of Clinical Innovation Partners, providing advisory and board leadership with pharma, tech, and investors. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you so much, Mindy, and I'm sorry that I gave you those words to have to read on this Zoom. Mindy, to get things started, would you mind putting up a word cloud for us? Because it's my understanding that as our audience was invited to register, they also provided a quick answer to the question of what does diversity mean for them? And I think the word cloud here, and if you're not familiar with word clouds, the size of the word in this image that's being shown is based on how many people gave that as their answer. And so we can see certainly some of the larger things that come to people's mind around ethnicity, gender, age, socioeconomic status. But we also see so many other considerations around diversity for this audience: national origin, cognitive disability, sexual orientation, education, physical disabilities, religion, and of course, location. And we heard, and thank you, Mindy, we heard from our panel earlier, so many of those themes start to come up that as I was thinking about this session and the mandate around diversity in sarcoidosis, in healthcare, and in research, so much of it starts to shake out to me as how do we manage care? How do we manage research across diversity of presentation, across geographic boundaries, across race, ethnicity, and gender. And so I'm hoping that with this group of experts, we're going to get into so many of those considerations and more. As was mentioned by Mindy, the Q&A section is open for questions that you have on this topic for these panelists, and we'll be keeping an eye there certainly as well. And Maria, I was hoping we could start with you. Brandy, in that last session, set up some very personal thoughts regarding both diversity of presentation as well as mental health considerations when managing her own care with sarcoidosis. What are your observations based on your work for things that people can do to start to help address some of those challenges around the diversity of presentation with sarcoidosis and how people are finding and managing care?
So it's a great question. I think Jessica had also said it is that advocacy piece, that self-advocacy piece, not being able to, fire your doctor. We have to be our own best advocates, whether you're dealing with sarcoidosis or any other, chronic illness. But the toll, the mental health toll that it takes when you're diagnosed with a chronic illness and the anxiety, not knowing, okay, what's going to be next? What are my next steps? But then also not having a physician or a team that you can rely on and support just adds to that stress, adds to that burden. Living in a rural area, the financial aspects of having to travel. She mentioned, Cleveland and Denver and whatnot. That leads to an incredible amount of stress, not just financial stress, but the emotional burden of having to get on an airplane or a train or get in the car for hours. It takes its toll. But I also think we also need to take a look at the physicians and the importance of them stating to people, and even though it's not their area of expertise, I know this can take a toll on you, but there's help. And giving patients their permission to say that this can affect your mental health, because that will help reduce and eliminate, hopefully, a stigma that's associated with mental health. We have enough of a stigma on mental health to begin with. Now you're dealing with a chronic illness, and now, some doctors think it's in your head. And you start to question yourself, and everybody knows their own body best. As I believe Cheryl had mentioned several times. So it's not just about what the patients can do. I think it's really about an awareness on the physician's part, on the nurse's part, that the diagnosis of any chronic disease takes its emotional toll. It's not just a physical thing, it takes its emotional toll. And with a rare disease, you're talking about, how do I connect with others? I'm grateful that we are living in a world where we have Zoom and we have, social media platforms to be able to connect with one another. Because, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we didn't have that ability to connect. And if you're diagnosed with a much more common illness, you can find support groups. With rare diseases, it's very difficult. So, be your own best advocate, and really, I think the need for doctors to recognize that, yes, mental health might not be their area of interest or specialty, but the importance of recognizing that, I think will help validate their patients' experience.
Dr. Obi, certainly patients need to be their own advocates, but their doctors very often want to be their advocates as well. And how do you, what best practices do you see when it comes to physicians helping to be good advocates for their patients, in particular when there's a diversity of challenges, including mental health, that sarcoidosis patient may be managing?
Great, thank you so much for that question. As a preface, I live and practice in a predominantly rural and resource-poor environment. About 85% of my patients are African Americans. I have a high proportion of patients who are uninsured or underinsured, and there's really a significant proportion of patients who also have a lot of mental challenges. The barriers I've seen in my practice, surrounding supporting patients, either coming from rural communities or who are dealing with, multiple challenges, center, I would say, around three major themes. I think one of the biggest one is reduced access to care, whether it's, access to expert sarcoidosis specialists or to, subspecialist care. Some patients have to drive, several hours to come see me, 2 hours, 3 hours. And that presents several challenges in terms of, not being able to come to clinic appointments or clinic visits. Sometimes creates, the perception that the patients are not, interested in their own care, or they're not being compliant with their care, or, ends up, they are bounced from physician to physician, either because, there's that perception that their appointments are going to be canceled, and things like that. So that's, I would say, one challenge. The other, of course, is the socioeconomic, disadvantage, where you have patients who have, fairly limited resources, not being able to afford medications or follow complex medication regimens. And so really, those are some of the challenges that I have seen, in patients in rural environments. Some of the things I've done to help with that are to try and consolidate care. Consolidate care, leverage technology, and simplify the care that the patients, are having. So what I've done is when patients come to see me for the first time, I try and get everything done, whether it's the labs, the physical exams, the pulmonary function test, have like a general overview of what is going on with the patient. And subsequently, it becomes easier to communicate with the patient. Things as simple as, phone calls, either to give them updates on results, to find out how they are doing, without having them come multiple times or having them, drive long distances. All those have gone a long way to, help with that. And many times it's just listening to patients and just hearing them talk and finding out what is most important to them. Sometimes it's really not what you as a physician think it's important. You have to listen to the patients. And it sometimes takes being creative. Many physicians have standard templates, and sometimes changing that template around to where you have a mixture of, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, so that you can address the patient's direct concerns.
Dr. Obi, I think our connection is getting a little lost. Let's give that a moment and see if we can bring you back. In the meantime, let me turn this topic over to you, Dr. Sweis. Dr. Obi, we lost you there for a moment. It looks like we have you back. I think we lost your conclusion there. If you just want to recap your final statement there on that last question.
Yeah, I think my final statement is, listening to the patient and hearing them and finding out what is most important, what bothers them the most. Sometimes it takes a simple question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel your sarcoidosis is affecting you? What is most burdensome to you? And addressing that. Sometimes it's just condensed to 1 or 2, major problems. Talk to them, address that.
Dr. Sweis, I was thinking how it must be interesting leading a sarcoidosis center, but thinking about the last panel and the diversity of presentation that some patients had, their challenge around diagnosis. I wonder, how do complex patients who may not have traditional sarcoidosis presentations, whatever that may even mean, how do they find you? What is that journey like for patients to be identified as a patient with sarcoidosis to actually get referred to a sarcoidosis center?
Thank you so much for having me. And it was really great listening to the stories of patients. I'm humbled by what I hear and what I see every day, because I hear these stories every single day. And although I've been a physician for 30 years, I've been providing sarcoidosis care since the year 2000. And it's not getting easier for patients. Things are getting more difficult because we're dealing with more challenges. I have to say, though, it's becoming easier now for patients to find specialists because of the ability to search them online, the ability to connect via social media. So foundations like Foundation of Sarcoidosis Research, the Bernie Mac Foundation, there are a lot of resources out there that did not exist when I started providing sarcoidosis care between the year 2000 and the year 2007 or 8. So patients find us online through social media, through foundations, or through referrals from subspecialists, their primary care physicians, or patients sometimes refer patients. So as a rheumatologist, I tend to see all types of sarcoidosis because I'm trained to deal with systemic diseases. I deal with a lot of scleroderma patients, systemic lupus, and other systemic diseases. So we are used to dealing with systemic complex diseases.
Are people coming to the clinic, though, for a diagnosis, or are they already navigating that challenging diagnostic journey before they're reaching the clinic?
We see both, but I would say 80 to 90% of what I see is the diagnosis is already made. Patients went through so many treatments and they're either having no hope for additional treatment or looking for a second or a third opinion. I see mostly African-American patients, and most of my patients are women, and my research focuses on African-American women with sarcoidosis.
And do you view mental health as being a part of a holistic program to support the patient living with sarcoidosis?
Absolutely. I think if you look at stress and the impact of stress on our lives in general, whether we have a chronic disease or we don't have a chronic disease, stress is bad. Stress is never good. And it's your mental health impacts your physical health. So I would say it's very important to have a healthy mind, a healthy soul to be able to combat this physical illness. It all goes hand in hand, and you can't just focus on one and neglect the other.
Thank you. Dr. Obi, you had mentioned your practice in a rural setting, and Brandy had mentioned earlier some of the geographic constraints about obtaining care. Are you seeing hope and promise in technology or other things that are starting to help improve access for people who are not within geographic access to a clinic that is skilled in sarcoidosis management?
Yes, Craig. So, it's amazing what the COVID pandemic has taught us as a medical community. Before the pandemic, we had a lot of no-shows, patients who couldn't keep their appointment either because they lived too far away, couldn't come as often as needed, or they had to, care for either children or elderly parents at home. When we closed our clinics to in-person visits, or limited, I should say, our clinics to in-person visits during the pandemic, we found out actually that almost all of our patients kept their phone appointments, whether it was, just, audio appointments or it was video appointments. We found that. And really, it's really not a huge technology. It's simple technology. And leveraging that can significantly improve access to care. I listened to Brandy's story, how she had to go from, North Dakota to Cleveland Clinic. If we can cut that distance by making all those visits virtual visits, it would help a lot. Sometimes not everything can be accomplished in a virtual visit, but if you do one in-person visit, the rest of it can actually be virtual. And it's really amazing how much that we, both as physicians as well as patients, can accomplish during a virtual visit. And,
Do you find that many of your
sometimes,
patients, are there any patients in your area that struggle with access to technology to support the visit? Or can it even fall back to a telephone if need be?
yes, indeed. It can fall back to a telephone. So it can just be a phone visit, and a flip phone does the job. A landline does the job. It doesn't have to be a smartphone. It doesn't really have to have video capability. A
I
simple
appreciate
phone
hearing
does
that
the
because
job.
I hate to imagine that our solution for a lack of access is another solution that has a lack of access in terms of equitable access to high-speed internet and the technology to enable that. So that's great to hear. Anne-Marie, are you seeing the same in terms of mental health access for patients leveraging telehealth, telemedicine today?
Absolutely. I think initially, like, most people, um, people had a hard time adjusting to it. I want to see you in person. But then over time, attendance increased, participation increased. We were able to run groups, virtually, where some people might have just been able to have called in while other people had access. But we did see, and I live in a pretty popular suburban area, plenty of people who did not have access to that technology. And we tried to figure out ways to get them that access, so that they could stay connected with their mental health providers. What we've seen, just regarding mental health through this pandemic, and the people that are struggling with depression and anxiety, as well as the rate of substance usage that has increased, and overdose deaths have increased dramatically. Lack of that connection, to treatment, can definitely be a big part of that. But we're grateful to be living in a time where most people can have some sort of connection, as Dr. Obi said, whether it just be a regular phone, landline, or a flip phone. There's still that ability to have that connection.
It's certainly one of those few silver linings coming out of this tragic year is the increased adoption and comfort among providers and patients in the use of video and other approaches for remote visits to maintain care and continuity.
Absolutely.
Dr. Spice, I'd like to switch back to another dimension around diversity that's so critical today. As we're thinking about race and ethnicity, you had mentioned earlier that a large number of patients in your practice are African American, which certainly makes sense with the epidemiology of the disease. What are some of the specific challenges that you're seeing in the African American sarcoidosis patient community in accessing care? And what are some of the strategies that you're seeing physicians be able to leverage that can help mitigate those challenges?
Thank you for this very important question, Craig. And let me just repeat the question. The challenges that we see in providing care for African American patients with sarcoidosis, and some of the strategies to help with these challenges, correct?
Right, that's right.
And I would say this applies not only to disease like sarcoidosis. We see similar challenges with diseases that affect African American patients, whether it's systemic lupus, systemic vasculitis, systemic sclerosis, or even polymyositis, or even gout and osteoarthritis. Okay, the access to care is definitely not the same, and there is lack of equity in terms of access to care. That could be determined by financial factors, but could be determined by geographic factors as well. And research is evolving as well into where the patients live. The zip code may determine a lot of things, not only access to care, but your health in general, the quality of air you breathe. So there are financial constraints among these patient groups. The jobs they do may limit their ability to come, for example, to morning or noon visits. Sometimes they can only come to the clinic as the last patient at 4:40, or we have to wait and see them maybe at 5 o'clock, to the point that I'm started to think about opening a Saturday clinic, or and I started doing a late evening Wednesday clinic because patients sometimes cannot take off, because taking off work, meaning they can't put food on the table for their kids next day. So there are a lot of challenges as physicians, we are not aware of them. What may seem like something very simple and something we used to every day. You have your coffee every day, you have your food. We don't think about $10 to pay for a bus ride. For some patients, even finding those $2 or $10 is a challenge. So consolidating care, providing them care at a time will not take from their work hours and will not decrease their paycheck, understanding what they're going through. As Dr. Obi mentioned, asking them what is most important to them, because just feeling someone is there caring about you makes a huge difference. If you feel your physician is understanding and there is hope for you, that may make the whole lot of difference. And minimizing tests that may not be needed. We oftentimes don't look at insurances. Some patients may have to pay 20% out of pocket, or they may need to meet a deductible before they undergo additional testing. So I think going to that personalized approach and looking at every patient challenge, and it's not one size fits all. That's why I think it takes a lot to understand every patient, what they go through, and certainly what African American patients go through is different. So what can we do? One person cannot do it. I may be able to open a clinic on a weekend or add evening visits, but it's a whole community. It's the medical community plus other partners that need to work together to minimize these health equities.
Thank you. I'd love to turn the conversation over towards research participation, and research access, because so many of these same barriers exist in the clinical trials and present as a lack of diversity, ultimately lack of representation in the studies for these new medicines. Can we take a look at the first poll question? And for the audience, we have a poll that we'd love to post up for you to share your perspective on. And Mindy, if you can fetch that first poll question for the audience. The first poll question we'll put up is asking about if you've been in a trial. So here it is. Question number one, have you been able to participate in a clinical trial? You can answer just with one choice. Yes, participated or are participating. No, not interested. No, didn't meet the eligibility criteria. No, have not been invited or asked, or it's not applicable for you. Go ahead and click your answer there, and we'll take a look in just a moment. We're going to really try to explore in just these next few minutes many of these same topics around access as it relates to clinical trials and some of the measures that researchers are taking today, whether to improve access constrained by geography or access for otherwise underrepresented patient populations, or even access for those with complex diseases who, as we were hearing earlier with Brandy, may be excluded from a trial just by the eligibility criteria. Mindy, can we see the answers for this first poll question? It's very dramatic.
Sorry, Craig, I'm not sure that I can actually show it. Let me try one thing here.
Okay. While we're pulling that up, let's keep this conversation around race and ethnicity that we were just talking about. And Dr. Obi, as a researcher, what are some of the considerations that you're trying to introduce to help make sure that you have representation in the studies that you're looking to enroll?
So Craig, I think that, access to research trials spans, or I should say challenges to access to research trials spans several different facets. I think you've mentioned, location or geographic, disease complexity, gender, racial, and all of it really come into play. So just by sharing a few personal experiences, I would just hope that I can bring to, bear some of that. So we run several trials, and I remember speaking with, a few people about joining the research. Some of the barriers I heard was they live too far. They're not able to make research appointments at certain times. First of all, they're worried about whether or not they would qualify, based on either their gender or their race. And sometimes, and not sometimes, all times, I would say it really takes to listening to the patients and being ready to be flexible. And so if the research team can be flexible around scheduling patients, it doesn't have to be at 8 a.m. If they have to drop children off at 8 a.m., it's okay to come at 9:30. If they have to be back at work at certain times, it's okay to schedule around them. I think that's one of the most important things. And I also think that it's important to try and consolidate what needs to be done in certain researches. If things can be done in one visit versus spreading it across 3 or 4 visits, I think those things would help a lot. One thing I've also found, especially in the African American community that I deal with, is just a lot of mistrust. Am I being used as a guinea pig? I've heard that question multiple times. Am I getting the placebo because I'm African American? And sometimes it takes just explaining, being very patient and explaining what research means, how they potentially can benefit from research, even if it's not a direct personal benefit, and encouraging them to enroll. I think just communication, working around the patient's schedule, and being willing as a researcher to be flexible. I also think that it's important to emphasize variety of researchers. So while not everybody may qualify for a randomized clinical trials per se, there's a lot of patients who are willing to be part of focus groups, who are willing to do, surveys. All that introduces them to research. And after they've done one successfully, they are willing to do another one. So I think just opening up, resources, opening up the opportunities and being flexible. I think those are some of the take-home points I would say.
It's very helpful. Dr. Schweiss, this theme around trust, such an important topic today in terms of earning trust from diverse communities who have not only been underrepresented, but in the past have been mistreated in the course of research. Do you, in the research that you're running today, how do you earn the trust from African American patients and others in communities that may be very cautious about research participation?
Thank you. This is very important. The issue of trust, when you talk about things like trust and culture, you're changing culture. Research shows that you're going to need years. So you cannot change these things in one day. And once the trust is broken, it's very difficult to build it again. So the question is, how can you assure that there is trust, and which trust are we talking about? Is it the trust when the patient walks to your office and the trust that this patient has in you as their physician? Or is it the trust in the medical community, the trust in the research related to sarcoidosis, the trust that we don't have medications approved by the FDA? So there are various levels of trust. So if the patient establishes that trust with their physician, my personal experience being a clinical trialist for so many years, your patients will listen to you. If you ask them to donate blood for research, they're going to do it. I've been collecting blood from patients for research for so many years. I never had a patient say, no, I don't want to give my blood. I think once you communicate with the patient, explain to them, that may not help you directly, but may help somebody else. A lot of patients are amazingly collaborative and want to participate. It's how we present these things to them. So there are different types of research. The research that requires surveys or donating a sample of blood or just prospectively following patients to look at outcome, this does not require much trust. It's, you build that trust with your patient and you tell them, can you participate? It's time actually what determines. And a lot of times patients are, I'm grateful, they're gracious with their time. They give their time for these surveys, knowing that nothing is going to come back in return to them directly. The clinical trials is the difficult part. And which clinical trials I'm talking about? Phase 1 and phase 2, because that's what I focus mostly on. That's the difficulty in getting patients, not only if they have sarcoid, but if they have anything else. Like imagine if someone comes to me and say, there is this clinical trial, Dr. Swice, that's gonna, if you participate in this as an anti-aging drug, it's gonna make you look younger by 10 years, okay? I'm gonna love to participate in that clinical trial, but deep inside as a human, I don't want to be in that placebo arm. How can you get patients to agree to participate in a clinical trial that does have a placebo arm? So add to this our lack of trust in the clinical trial design. If we talk that we don't have outcome measures, and then here I'm convincing a patient, let me give you a drug, and by the way, the consent form reads that you may die from this medicine. So it takes a lot to participate in clinical trials. It's a stress for the physician who's offering the clinical trial and a stress for the patient. I think being honest about it and telling the patients how much we don't know about this disease, and the only way to know is the clinical trial. And there is a chance you will go into the placebo, but if you go into the placebo arm, I'm not going to let you die. There is always an exit strategy, and there is a rescue arm, because we don't agree to do anything that's not ethical. Once the patient know that you're going to do to them what you're going to do to yourself and to your family members, you will not hear a no.
The good news here is when surveyed, and this isn't sarcoidosis data, this is just clinical trial participation data, 9 out of 10 patients who've been in trials when surveyed say they received the same or better care than they did when they were not in a trial. Patients who are in trials typically feel like they're spending more time with their providers, that research coordinators are able to follow up with them more frequently. And so I think that when patients are able to learn from other patients who've participated in research, that tends to be very favorable. Certainly, though, patients want to learn about research from their doctors. 49% of patients, when surveyed, indicate that their number one preference for how to learn about a trial is from their treating physician. And so as I look at the poll that our audience completed, there's some really good signs here, right? The number of people who are not interested in research is incredibly low, but yet only a small number have actually been able to participate. The vast majority were never invited. And then the second leading response was, I wasn't eligible to participate. And so as researchers, Dr. Obi, maybe we'll start with you. How do we overcome these barriers that so many people would like to participate in research, they're just not being invited, or they're hitting overly restrictive eligibility criteria.
So I'm just looking at this, this poll is actually quite interesting. I think that as a medical community, we actually are not doing enough to tell patients about research opportunities. And I think some of that perception may actually be with us. Sometimes you have the feeling that you don't want to bother the patients, or that you think the patients would not be receptive, or, it may be taking extra time away from your clinical responsibilities, extending whatever clinic visit time you have. Or it may just be some implicit bias that you have that the patient may say no. So I think that that really should start with us. I think that we should begin to understand that our patients want to do more. They want to be more involved in research. They're just waiting to be asked. It just takes time. And I like how Dr. Swiss put it. It takes building trust. If you've actually built trust with your patient, they're able to ask you questions, and they won't be superficial questions. There'll be questions that, they've thought about, and questions that can sway them one way or the other. And I think, to borrow her words, explaining to them that, we don't know, and that you're not doing anything that you wouldn't do to yourself or to your family members would go a long way. So I think that, throwing that open and then looking inwards at the biases or the restrictions that we have in terms of asking patients, I would say is something that is really needed here.
I think that's a very honest view on that. Thank you, Dr. Roby. There is a question from the audience asking, are there mechanisms to improve access to clinical trials in the wake of COVID-19? Any new coordination effort to allow some aspects of treatment to happen virtually? I am going to change my hat from moderator to responder for some of this and answer an emphatic yes. As Mindy had mentioned in my introduction, I am the co-chair of the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, and that is a collaboration of 130 organizations from the US FDA, some of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, tech companies, and advocacy groups working together to drive the global adoption of this type of flexibility that the question is asking about. Just as we've seen is, as Dr. Obi was mentioning earlier, in the adoption of video for visits for patients in healthcare, we're seeing exactly the same in clinical trials. Now, one of the challenges for clinical trials is we often need to measure something specific, an endpoint or an outcome, but we are seeing strategies that let us do that with people not being at the research site or simply coming in less frequently for that to be able to occur. Likewise, getting investigational medicines for patients, sometimes they have to be infused, such as with monoclonal antibodies and other protein therapeutics. But even there, the ability for, in some cases, people to receive an infusion in the home has been introduced by a number of companies that are testing new medicines. And so I'll add to some of the optimism that was being shared earlier around technology to support care, that I think we're seeing some great signals of the same approaches to improve access for clinical trials across geographic boundaries. Now, I will follow Louise's finale of her panel by also going into a bit of a speed round. And for my speed round for these last 5 minutes together, I'm going to give you each a magic wand and give you the opportunity to fix something that is standing in the way of improving access for patients with sarcoidosis, either to care or for research. Anne-Marie, let's start with you. If you could fix one thing in this ecosystem with that magic wand, where would you point it?
It's a good question. I want to say financial. I think that finance is such an impediment for many people. When you're dealing with rare diseases, many of the times we're looking at the focus being at larger institutions, maybe in the cities and whatnot, and many people might not have access or the ability to get there. So if transportation and finances could be eliminated, I think that could assist people in more a greater participation, because that would relieve a lot of stress for people.
It's a great starting place. Dr. Obi, I'm giving you next this magic wand. What is something that you would want to fix first that's going to improve access, a strategy you would look to deploy?
I would consolidate and simplify care, and I would leverage simple technology. We can do a lot with just a flip phone. That's what I would do.
Succinct and powerful.
That's what I would do. I think that patients shouldn't have to come multiple times. I think that patients shouldn't have to drive 2-3 hours to see a physician. I think we can make life simpler.
I think that's a great point. And certainly I think many of us as just people, consumers in our everyday life are seeing so much of that coming out of COVID that it just makes sense that we should be able to use some of these approaches. Dr. Swice, take us home, take that magic wand. What would you want to fix or change to improve access for sarcoidosis patients?
Actually, what I would dream about fixing relates to patients, because we can talk forever about the healthcare system and the research funding. I really would like to fix hearts. I really like patients to have hope and be their own advocate. It starts with you. So don't let depression get to your heart. The future is bright and we're going to get there.
Mindy, I think that is a fabulous way to wrap up the conversation today. I would like to thank Dr. Obi, Dr. Swice, and Anne-Marie for your time, and of course to the audience for sharing your time with us this evening. Mindy, I think we're headed into our next break.
Indeed we are, Craig. Thank you all for this amazing panel session and such a great conversation and insight. With that, I will go ahead and let people go on their break for 10 minutes, well, actually 13 minutes, and we'll excuse the panel, and we will see you back here in 13 minutes at the top of the hour, and you can go ahead and step away and stretch. I know I'd like to stretch, and you'll get me back in about 10 minutes. So again, thank you to everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mindy. Thank you.